Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm your host, Lisa Pugh. A hotly contested redistricting case that will decide the future of Wisconsin's state legislature and congressional districts is before the Supreme Court this week. Oral arguments begin, and here with us, they start on Wednesday. Here with us today is UW political science professor Barry Burden. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to start with a little bit of a simplified timeline to illustrate just kind of how complicated this case is. So let's look at how we got here. This really started back in August with the release of the U.S. Census results showing shifts in Wisconsin's population. Almost immediately after that, we had two court cases filed, one in federal court on behalf of Democratic voters asking the federal court to step in and draw Wisconsin maps if the governor and the legislature couldn't agree. A similar case by conservative group WILL, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, asking the state Supreme Court to decide the maps, which they eventually did. As was expected, the legislature and the governor are not able to agree. The legislature passes a map that the governor ultimately vetoes. The state Supreme Court then tells the interested parties, submit your maps, and we will use a least changes approach, which is something that you and I will talk a little bit about. We start oral arguments, as I said, on Wednesday, and then everyone's working toward a March 1st deadline. So many players, so many eyes on this case, so much at stake. Is this like the Super Bowl of state Supreme Court races or cases?
It is. It's getting more attention, I think, than almost anything else the court does. And the court has decided to devote a lot of time to it. There will be, I think, 8 parties that have submitted maps. They will all get some time to argue their case in court. That's going to make a long hearing, much longer than the court would normally give. One reason the Democrats were hoping to steer this case to federal court instead is that they wanted a real trial with witnesses and, spending several days on the case. This will not be at that extent, but it will be more than the Supreme Court would normally give to a case.
So what is the court ultimately deciding?
Well, some maps need to be put in place for this year's congressional elections and state legislative elections. So that's a total of 3 maps. You've got U.S. House districts, of which there are 8. You've got state assembly districts, 99, and 33 state Senate districts. Those need to be put in place by late winter or early spring. There's some disagreement about that between the parties, but they need to be in place so that candidates know what districts they live in and where they can file, so that they know where to collect signatures and run ultimately in the party primaries in August.
And so this is an exercise that does happen every decade in conjunction with the census results, correct?
Yes, it's mandated by the U.S. Constitution and by state law and the state constitution. When the new data arrive, the districts have to be redrawn, most immediately to account for population shifts. So in the 8 congressional districts, those districts need to be reconfigured so that they do not differ really at all in terms of population. But of course, some parts of the state grow faster than others. Some are actually shrinking, so those need to be reconfigured. That's also true for the Assembly and Senate districts. They don't need to be an exact agreement in terms of population, but they need to be close. And then it's an opportunity, really, for the parties to try to gain some advantage because they know the districts are being redrawn to account for population shifts. 10 years ago, it was Republicans who were in full control of the process, and they took advantage and drew maps that were very advantageous to the party. This time around, as you say, it's a stalemate, so it looks like it's going to be the courts in some fashion that end up making the maps.
So when you look at those census results, are there any particular parts of the state or shifts in population that really make this time around different than 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think the explosion of population in Dane County is the most obvious. This is the fastest growing part of the state or close to it. It's booming in terms of the number of people who are moving to this part of the state. And so the number of districts in the Dane County area is going to be greater than they need to be. They need to be smaller in size because we're trying to maintain equal populations. The other place that's moving fast is St. Croix County, which is up in the northwest part of the state. It's really a Minneapolis, St. Paul suburb. That area's been growing too, and so those are 2 areas that are probably most noticeable. There are also rural areas of the state that are losing population. So there's movement all over the place. I would say also some of the information that comes from the Census Bureau is about the racial and ethnic makeup of the state. Mm-hmm. And those are important considerations because there is a federal law, the Voting Rights Act, that requires the state to make an effort to give racial and ethnic minorities an opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. And that's where some of the dispute among the maps is about exactly how much of an opportunity they want to give.
Sure. You know, you mentioned that the Democrats and some progressive groups that filed one of the first lawsuits really wanted this to be decided in federal court. And history shows us that it is actually kind of unusual for the state Supreme Court to be taking a case like this, and that the federal courts have, for the last 3 decades, really, when there's been this dispute, come in and drawn Wisconsin maps. How did we end up in the state Supreme Court this time around?
Yeah, things are different this time around for a few reasons. One is the conservative groups got in right away, asking the state Supreme Court to take up the case. The state Supreme Court might have taken up the case 10 years ago if there had been a case. But really, the dispute was of a different nature because it was one party that drew the maps. It wasn't about a stalemate. It was about groups that were unhappy with what Republicans had done, challenging it, and they did that in federal court. That case about the assembly districts, called Gill v. Whitford, actually went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court just 3 years ago said this is not an issue for the federal courts. This is a matter of partisanship and politics. One party trying to harm the other party and advantage themselves. Federal courts have no role in that. And so that's really to diminish the ability of Democrats or anyone who's unhappy with maps to go to the federal courts for a solution. The other reason the federal courts have gone first in previous cycles is that the state Supreme Court has sort of not had its act together in previous cycles, and the federal courts got to the case faster. This time around, again, conservative groups got into the state Supreme Court first. The federal courts have said, we're ready to hold a trial if it's needed, but we're going to allow the state Supreme Court to do its work this week. If it can produce a remedy that meets federal requirements, then we don't need to hold a trial and we'll cancel all of this business. But they are waiting in the wings in the event that the state Supreme Court can't reach a resolution period, or can't reach one in time for the districts to be in place.
So that's one reason why there really is a lot of pressure on what's happening here in the state Supreme Court this week. We talked a little bit about the what. Now I want to move on to the who. So we have a slide showing the who's who of Wisconsin redistricting. So we have various attorneys representing voters, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty representing some voters of interest in the case. Of course, there is the Republican legislature that's submitted a map for consideration. Governor Evers has submitted a map for consideration. The Republican congressional members have submitted their own map for consideration, and then various activist groups that have some stake in the case are some of the players. When you think about all of those players in the court this week, what are some of the things or the different arguments that we might hear from those different parties?
Well, everyone should have in mind what the state Supreme Court has said is going to be their standard, which is maintaining the least amount of change as possible from the current maps, the ones that were enacted a decade ago. So they're going to have a preference for keeping the cores of the districts intact and modifying them as little as possible. That, of course, works to the advantage of the Republicans because they're the ones who drew those maps 10 years ago. But that's the bias that the court has put in place. So there's a little bit of a competition among the maps that have been submitted to be the ones that have the least change, hoping that the court will grab that one, just kind of objectively to say, well, this is the one that comes closest to our standard of no change, if possible, really only reflecting population shifts. Both the Evers map and the Republicans in the legislature have submitted maps that are probably the closest to that standard. Minimal changes, moving people from one district to another, minimal changes in terms of shifting lines from one place to another, or moving people, especially between state Senate districts, because those state Senate seats are held asynchronously. They're every 2 years. Half of them are up. 2 years later, the other half would be up. So if you move people from one district to another, in the state Senate in particular, it's possible they could go 2 election cycles without being able to vote for a candidate for that office. So Evers and the Republicans in particular, I think, have been very aware of what the court has said as its standard and are hoping that they're on the leading edge and will be the map that's selected.
Sure. So you're talking about this least changes approach, which also was a somewhat unusual directive for the court to provide to parties interested in submitting maps. Can you talk a little bit more about what is least changes as a standard in producing maps, and how does it compare to other more traditional principles that have been used in the past in map drawing?
Well, the standard's actually not in the state constitution, not in the federal constitution, not in state law. This is something that the state Supreme Court attached itself to, thinking this was an appropriate role for them. There are lots of requirements in federal and state law. Equal population is number one, so districts need to be drawn to have either identical populations or close populations. Districts need to be contiguous, meaning every district needs to have a single shape. It can't be separated into different pieces that are unconnected. There's the Voting Rights Act at the federal level, which mandates that line drawers try to produce maps that don't dilute the votes of minority voters, racial and ethnic minorities. And there's some other requirements. Those are the main ones. Trying to keep also municipal, town, county boundaries undivided and unsplit as much as possible. So try to hold those communities together. The least change standard really is something that the Supreme Court has cooked up from reading other cases from around the country, and I think reflects their preference not to have the courts get too involved. So they're thinking, what's the least we can do to get to maps that are acceptable, that can work for the next decade? We know that the existing maps have worked. They've been in place for 10 years. There was a case that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided not to be involved. So they've already survived scrutiny of the courts. So the Supreme Court, at least the majority justices, have said, let's get as close as we can to the existing maps and just be done with this. So it's sort of a way of washing their hands, I think, of the case and trying to move to resolution as quickly as possible.
So given the population shifts that you talked about earlier, is a least changes approach appropriate, or is it appropriate to prioritize that over the other standards that you mentioned?
Well, that's probably a matter of politics. Republicans would say, of course, this is the right standard. And we in the legislature think we have the right to initiate the map drawing process, and the governor's getting in the way. And the maps we drew 10 years ago are just fine. They were okayed by the U.S. Supreme Court, and there were no other cases that brought them down. So let's stick to something that's close to those. Democrats would say, no, this is an absurd standard. This is not something that's in law or in the Constitution, and we should start with a blank slate, look at the population as it is based on the new census data, account for all the criteria of contiguousness and equal population, the voting rights, keeping counties and municipalities together, and produce maps that are fair. Their argument would be that the existing maps have a pro-Republican advantage in them, which is true. And so keeping the least changes standard in place, or using that as a standard, is really baking in that Republican advantage from 10 years ago for another 10 years. I think the majority on the court is not going to be open to that argument. The conservative majority has said, we're not going to talk about partisanship. That's not a concern for us. We're not going to look at that. It's least changes and the other mandatory criteria, and that's it.
You know, one of the briefs filed in this case has called this the beauty pageant of maps, that there are the series of, I think, is it 5 or 6 maps in front of the court, and that they might pick their favorite, which one meets the standard that you discussed, the least changes. So we have some maps up on the screen that show some of the maps that the court has to choose between. So you see the current map, the way that the congressional districts are drawn now from 10 years ago, compared to the Republican legislature's congressional district map, and side by side with Governor Evers' proposed map. When you look at those different maps, the ones in front of the court for discussion this week, what are the major differences?
Well, I'll just say there are a lot of similarities. If you look at those maps on the screen, the 3 sets of congressional districts look a lot alike. There's one sort of in the Madison area, that's District 2. There's one up in the Northwest, that's District 7. So the changes are minimal, and that's reflecting the mandate from the court. But you can also see that the Democrats in Evers and the other Democratic-leaning groups are proposing maps that push things a little bit in their favor, as much as they can, given the least changes standard. And Republicans are doing the opposite, trying to shift the districts slightly in their favor. It's maybe easiest to see with the 3rd district, which is the one that runs along the western part of the state. It's currently Ron Kyne's district along the Mississippi River. That's one that's been one of the swingier congressional districts. Evers' map sort of keeps that swinginess there, and the funny shape that you see in the middle of the state is part of that. Republicans would prefer to push it in a Republican direction and hopefully tip it to get a new Republican incumbent who would hold that district for the next 10 years at least.
One of the issues of major concern in this discussion has been the number of majority black assembly districts required under the Voting Rights Act that you mentioned earlier. Where do you think the court will land on that, and do you think that is something that might end up in the federal court as a challenge?
It might. I think there are a couple of situations that might result in the federal courts getting involved. One would be if the state Supreme Court can't reach a resolution, particularly if the conservative justices can't agree on one of these maps to pick, or maybe, and by the way, they don't need to pick one of them. They could pick a hybrid and kind of put two of them together. They could appoint someone to draw maps that sort of build from those. So it's not necessarily only this menu that they're limited to. But if they can't reach agreement, it may be the federal courts have to get involved just to get this done. But even if the Supreme Court does adopt a map, there may still be challenges over the Voting Rights Act, especially about African American representation in the Assembly. The Republican-leaning maps have pushed towards creating districts that have at least 50% black populations, majority-minority districts they're called. The Evers map doesn't do that at all. It actually creates no majority-minority districts, and all of the districts that would give black voters influence are ones where blacks are between 40 and 50% of the population. So the idea is that if African Americans make up, say, 43% of the district, together with some white votes, they could together vote for a candidate, a kind of coalition candidate. Those are sometimes called influence districts because the black vote is influential in the outcome, or performance districts because the black vote can perform in the way it wants. They're different terminologies. I think that's going to be a really important consideration because it's maybe the place where you see the biggest difference between the various sets of maps that have been submitted. And that could be something that ends up in federal courts because it is the Federal Voting Rights Act, after all, that has something to say about that.
You know, another issue that folks have questions about is that the Republican-controlled legislature ultimately submitted a map to the court that's the same map that the governor vetoed. If the court chooses that map, does that have an implication for upsetting balance of powers in any way?
Yeah, boy, there's some big legal principles here that we can't resolve on the program, but one of them that's been floating around really nationally for the last few years is whether legislatures in particular ought to have predominance when it comes to drawing districts or creating any election rules. There's something called the independent state legislature doctrine that says actually the U.S. Constitution mentions legislatures by name as having the power to do these various things, like designing election rules in their states, and that maybe courts would prefer to give the legislature preference when there's a dispute between the branches. None of that has been resolved. It's all sort of legal theory at this point. But I think there is likely to be a case at some point that gets to the U.S. Supreme Court that will try to resolve these things. And the Wisconsin case could be one of the considerations on the path to ultimately figuring that out.
So we talked about the parties in the case. One thing we haven't talked about are the justices. So as you mentioned earlier, there's a conservative-leaning 4-3 majority in our state Supreme Court right now. When you look at the members of the court, what sort of arguments or comments might we hear from those members, and is there anyone who's pivotal on the court?
Yeah, so it is a 4-3 conservative majority, and that's one reason why Republicans and conservative groups like Will wanted this case to be in the state Supreme Court. Democrats would have hoped to get a more favorable judge in a federal court. So I think the default prediction would be probably the conservatives hang together and reach some kind of conclusion that produces a map that's very much like the maps that are in place now. But there is a possibility in particular of Justice Hagedorn splitting off or having some matter of, an opinion on some matter that's different from his fellow conservatives. Even in the order that the court issued to create this hearing on Wednesday, Hagedorn agreed with the other conservatives that we ought to adopt a least changes map, that was the right way to go. But he wrote a separate opinion saying, it would be okay if we considered other things too, like keeping communities of interest together or trying to, produce maps that are good looking, where the districts are not irregular in their shape. So it's possible that he will resist maybe the temptation for all the conservatives to vote in a uniform way. He has been a kind of rogue justice during his time on the court, sometimes breaking with conservatives, sometimes really frustrating conservatives around the state by not voting in lockstep with the other conservatives on the court. So he's part of the mystery as to what the court will do and could be a contributor to maybe the court not reaching an outcome. If there can't be a firm conclusion, then the court might end up throwing up its hands, and that's, again, another opportunity for the federal courts to be involved.
In that timeline, we mentioned that there's this federal case. You said it's waiting in the wings, Hunter versus Bosselman. What happens to that case if the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, ultimately selects a map in the course of these hearings? What happens to that case? Will it still continue?
It could disappear or it could continue, and I think it mostly depends on whether there are any remaining federal issues that have not been resolved by the state's case. So if the state Supreme Court adopts a map that satisfies all the state criteria, we're done in terms of the state litigation. But if there's a secondary complaint about that map violating the Voting Rights Act in some way, or some element of the U.S. Constitution, then the federal courts could get back involved. I think it's probably only with voting rights and minority representation where that could happen, because again, the Wisconsin case from 3 years ago that went to the U.S. Supreme Court resulted in the federal court saying, yeah, any constitutional issues, we're not wrestling with those if they're just about partisanship. A First Amendment complaint that one side is being discriminated against in terms of its opinions, not a concern for us when it comes to parties working against one another. I think it would really only be with Voting Rights Act stuff, and even then it's probably not the entire map that's being challenged, but maybe just a handful of districts where the size of the minority population is the question. Should it be 40%? Should it be 45, 50, or something else? So even if the federal courts get involved at that point due to voting rights issues, I think the large chunk of the maps that the state Supreme Court adopts will probably remain in place even through that litigation.
So we talked about the Republican legislators' map and the governor's map. We haven't talked about the activist groups. So there are other maps on the table. Black Leaders Organize for Communities. There's a mathematicians group. Can you talk a little bit about why those parties submitted maps, and will the court look at those closely too?
Well, they are in the mix, and they'll get to make their case before the justices, just like Evers and the Republicans get to. My guess is they probably get less serious attention than the Evers maps and the legislature's maps for a couple reasons. One is they're not elected officials, and so they don't actually have a role in the policymaking process. State Supreme Court might be biased in favor of people who are actually involved in drawing the maps in the first place, which should be elected officials. The other is, if you look at the maps, they don't meet the criteria as well as the Evers maps and the Republican maps do. They generally move more voters from one district to another. They generally change the lines more than is necessary, so they're not meeting the least changes standard as much as the Evers and Republican maps are. The population deviations between the districts are sometimes quite large, so they're not maintaining that concern. So regardless of who drew them, I think just on criteria, probably they're not going to be as satisfactory to the state Supreme Court as the legislators' and governor's maps are.
If you were drawing the map, what is a fair map? How would you define that?
Well, there's probably no definition. I think, it's in the eye of the beholder to some degree. We know there are criteria that have to be met: equal population, contiguousness, maintaining communities of interest, and all of that. From a political scientist point of view, our focus is often on partisan fairness. A fair map would be one that is symmetric in treating the two parties equally. That doesn't mean that each party should get 50% of the seats. If you're in a state where one party tends to win many more votes than the others, they should get more votes and more seats. But if the situation was reversed, that the other party was suddenly doing better in terms of winning votes, it ought to be rewarded with winning seats. And I think one concern about maps in Wisconsin and some North Carolina and Ohio and some other states is that one party has essentially baked in its advantage so much that it's not really possible for the other party to gain back a majority. In all of the maps that are sitting before the state Supreme Court, including Democrat Governor Evers' map, Democrats really have no shot at winning the state legislature. They would have to win more votes than the Republicans by somewhere between 5 percentage points and 15 percentage points just to get to a tie in the state legislature. It's very rare for one party to win statewide elections in Wisconsin by 5 to 15 percentage points. So it's going to have to be an exceptional wave that would ever give the Democrats a chance in the state legislature, and maybe never in the congressional districts, at least for the next 10 years.
When you talk about a baked-in outcome in the maps, particularly with the least changes approach, for the person who's sitting at home, What's really at stake? I hear people talking about a veto-proof majority in the state legislature. Is that one thing to think about at home about what's being decided here?
That is a possibility. What we've seen for the last 2 years is real stalemate between the governor and the legislature. They've agreed on almost nothing. Aside from passing the state budget a couple of years back, which was sort of a miracle, on everything else, on coronavirus, on taxing and spending, on political matters, on stay-at-home and public health orders, been massive disagreements and real dysfunction, I would say, between the branches. That dysfunction will continue as long as the Democrats have success at winning the governor's race and Republicans have the state legislature. But the dynamic could change if the Republicans actually get to a veto-proof majority so that they could produce legislation, have it sent back by Evers, and then override it. Right now, most of the efforts have been in the courts. So when Evers and Republicans can't get along and can't agree on public health or school policy or anything else, it's been in the courts where one side or another or an outside group has filed suit. And that includes in redistricting, where we're seeing lawsuits being handled this week. So it would be really consequential if Republicans not only got a pretty sizable advantage in the state legislature, but had an advantage that was so large that gave them at least a shot for a time period of having a veto-proof majority. Now that matters less if they win the governorship this year, then they've got it all, and the size of the majority is probably of less importance. But it would be nice insurance for a party to have to say, not only do we have the legislature almost as a certainty, but our majorities are going to be large enough that we could probably combat a Democratic governor if one's in office.
Sure. What are the deadlines we're working with here? When will Wisconsin have new maps?
Well, there's some disagreement about that too. So we know the hearing in the state Supreme Court is this week. We don't know when the court will issue a ruling. Probably depends on how much agreement there is among the conservative four, whether they can produce something consensually pretty quickly. The maps that have been submitted, none of them are ideal, and I think actually most of them are not made out of the wards that we use statewide to actually build districts, so probably none of them could be selected as they are today. So there's going to be some work, kind of technical work behind the scenes to produce those. I don't know what that means in terms of timeline. More than days, probably weeks. One deadline we do have in mind is March 1st, because the federal court has said in its order that if there is not action from the state Supreme Court, or a decision really from the state Supreme Court, the federal courts are ready to get involved and issue some kind of ruling by March 1st. They have set that timeline because candidates who want to run in the August primary need to take out papers in April to begin petitioning to get on the ballot. I think it's in mid-March that the Wisconsin Elections Commission would issue guidance on what districts candidates live in so they know where to collect signatures. So just sort of working backwards, it's surprisingly early that you need to know when those districts are in place. Now, Democrats have been pushing the state Supreme Court to act more quickly because they would like to see the federal courts get involved if possible. The Republicans and conservatives are saying there's no hurry, it's fine. Let's let the Supreme Court have full control over this and do what they need to do. But I would guess it's going to be a matter of weeks. Probably sometime in February, we're going to see some fast action from the state Supreme Court and know whether the feds are getting involved or not.
Okay, well, we're not anywhere near the end of the story. Much more to watch this week. Thank you for joining us and breaking it down for us today.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and thank you to the viewers of Newsmakers. Be sure to tune in again as we highlight the issues and sit down with the decision makers who make a difference in our state and for all of us.
This program is a production of Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Eye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civic broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.